Today's video is to review The Seafarer, which you read independently in week 2, but this time get the opportunity for me to expand upon and explain some of the things that maybe you didn't get independently. It is still so important for you to independently attempt the questions that I pose for you, and I will give you credit for them if I can see that attempt is made. However, I do understand that these Anglo-Saxon texts are not the easiest to understand, and so that's why today's activity will have you revisit The Seafarer and use a Google form to complete some questions based on the watching of this video. So the watching of the video is essential to get the answers that I want you to fill in as evidence that you did in fact watch the video. So let's go ahead and get started. Just to review, in this particular poetry unit, we've already taken a look at riddles, but we're going to take a look at the Seafarer, the Wanderer, and the Wife's Lament. And one thing thematically that these three have in common is that they all contain a theme of loss of some sort, as well as the importance of social bonds and when those social bonds are gone. So in this case, different forms of exile. Okay, and you took notes on this when you were independently listening or reading through The Seafarer in week 2. The three types of exile are exile by choice, exile by force, and exile by God or spiritual exile. And just as a note, the exile by God or spiritual exile is something actually we only see in the selection from Beowulf we will do actually starting next week. So we will see either exile by choice or exile by force in one of the 3 Anglo-Saxon poems that you will study from the Exeter book in this small unit. One thing I wanted to bring up was a slide that I had in our riddles work from one of our all remote days. These were poetic devices I said were present in Anglo-Saxon riddles, but they're present in all Anglo-Saxon poetry. Alliteration being one of them, the occurrence of the same letter or sound at the beginning of adjacent or closely connected words. And secondly, kennings, all right? 2 words are kind of combined or put near each other to refer to a person or thing. For example, in Anglo-Saxon poetry, the sea is a major element because if you can imagine these Germanic tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, they all traveled by boat to get to the land that became England. And so, the sea was called the whale road. And these kennings are metaphorical in nature, and they're commonly found in Old Norse and Old English poetry. Some modern day examples of kennings would be things like, instead of calling the telephone a telephone, we might call it a conversation communicator. And notice there's alliteration present in that as well. So the kenning can contain alliteration. Instead of an umbrella, something might be poetically renamed a rain shielder. Or instead of a surfer, you might call someone a wave rider. And these are different ways that the poet can refer to the same things while at the same time offering insight into the nature of that thing that's being renamed. So some examples of Anglo-Saxon kennings are listed in front of you. They were explained to you in your Anglo-Saxon riddles activity last week. But these are some examples that I think really show the creativity of the Anglo-Saxons. Again, it also offered the traveling poet or storyteller, that traveling bard. I showed you that video of that guy playing the lyre. It offered them a variety of ways they could refer to the same thing without having to just repeat the word a bunch of times. So you were asked to take a look at some kennings in The Seafarer, and I realized it probably would be beneficial to you to have that reminder. So The Seafarer was on page 21 of the text. Obviously, I highlighted the PDF for you and attached it for your reference to the Seafarer posting. The overview of the poem, and I had this on the worksheet that I had you work on as well. Again, it was a Google Slides. It said that there is a lonely seafarer, so someone who fares on the sea. He's like a sailor. And he's drifting in icy waters far from human contact. And what happens in the poem is even though he laments how he's drowning in desolation, which is awfulness, he keeps finding himself wanting to go back to it again and again. And then in the second part of the poem, he realizes that life itself, no matter where it's spent, is honestly a form of exile because man's true home or the soul's true home is in heaven. Now, that whole bit about where your true home is in heaven was not in the original Anglo-Saxon poem. This is a great example of what I talked about in our background notes of the fact that the Catholic Church came in, the monks who were literate, they could read and write, they started recording the stories that were passed down just by word of mouth by those shops or traveling storytellers, the bards that would perform and share in the mead halls. So the monks would write down the stories that were passed among the people they were now living among, and they add Christian elements to it so that these stories, when written down, point to the Christian God. Christianity has a major role in British literature, and this is an example of it being forced upon, I guess, the stories of the Anglo-Saxons. They didn't have much choice in the matter. Okay, so I'm going to have a couple questions for you in Google Forms, and they're not the same questions I had on the worksheet, but I will review those at the end. But you're going to listen to my explanations, and so you can know what to put in them. This would be a great time to have a split screen. If you have not practiced with opening up a new tab and splitting your screen, I would do that at this point. So the first question I have is, what in the world is this poem about? So I'm going to read a selection from the beginning. It says, "This tale is true in mind. It tells how the sea took me, swept me back and forth in sorrow and fear and pain, showed me suffering in 100 ships, in 1,000 ports, and in me. It tells of smashing surf when I sweated in the cold of an anxious watch, perched in the bow as it dashed under cliffs. My feet were cast in icy bands, bound with frost, with frozen chains, and hardship groaned around my heart. Hunger tore at my sea-weary soul." Sounds like this story is about a guy on a boat who is sad and afraid and in pain. He's hungry too. So if you just want to summarize that in a statement, in the introduction of this, that is what he says this tale is about, this story is about. His time at sea and all those emotions. It's not an easy life, and that's certainly part of what this poem reveals to us. Oh, that slide's not supposed to be there. So the Seafarer, this is obviously a first-person poem. Who are the only people that can get or understand this experience? So I'm going to pull this other selection from the text. This is from a direct quote from the poem. It says, "No man sheltered on the quiet fairness of earth can feel how wretched I was, drifting through winter on an ice-cold sea, whirled in sorrow, alone in a world blown clear of love, hung with icicles." Who are the only people that get him and understand him? Nobody that gets to stay just on the land. Only other people that are, it's kind of implied that only other people who are sailors or are seafarers would ever understand this. Nobody that is on the land can understand how wretched this experience is. All right, he describes sea life here. What is it like? Now, I want you to think about geographically on a map where England sits and where these Germanic, the origins of where these Germanic tribes came from as they traveled over to England. It's pretty high away from the equator. It's cold. It's colder the more you move north, okay? So in this particular part, you're going to be asked to record some of the details that describe sea life. And here's a selection from the text. "The hailstorms flew. The only sound was the roaring sea, the freezing waves. The song of the swan might serve for pleasure, the cry of the seafowl, the death noise of birds instead of laughter, the mewing of gulls instead of mead. Storms beat on the rocky cliffs and were echoed by icy feathered terns, which are a type of bird, and the eagle's screams. No kinsman could offer comfort there to a soul left drowning in desolation." So he hears the roaring sea along with the cry of the various birds. Hailstorm comes around. It's freezing cold. So this is the type of explanation that we get for sea life. It reminds me, if you ever watch on the Discovery Channel, like The Deadliest Catch, those guys are kind of an example of people who go out to sea who really live a rough life. And obviously it's worth it for them, for the money that they make. But if you've ever watched an episode of that, I might Google search that real quick if I were you to take a look. It's pretty intense. It also reminds me of some of the desolation and isolation that an astronaut might feel. This is a movie poster for the film Gravity, but it's not a pleasant thing what they're experiencing out there. But as we learn from the Seafarer, there are some things that still draw them to that type of job. Okay. So lines 27 through 38, what's the deal? What makes this guy keep going out? Why doesn't it seem to make sense to him? So we're going to read these lines now, and you're going to write some notes in the spot I give you in the Google form. It said, "And who could believe, knowing but the passion of cities swelled proud with wine and no taste of misfortune, how often, how wearily I put myself back on the paths of the sea, Night would blacken, it would snow from the north, frost bound the earth, and hail would fall, the coldest seeds. And how my heart would begin to beat, knowing once more the salt waves tossing in the towering sea. The time for journeys would come, and my soul called me eagerly out, set me over the horizon, seeking foreigners' homes. So in this passage, lines 27 to 38, we really get some insight that he puts himself back out there. When the time for journeys would come, I'm looking at the bottom part of this, he says, my soul called me eagerly out. Something about him inside is drawn to this. And who could believe it? That's what the first line of the selection says. You know, we're in the cities, there's full of wine and no misfortune. He finds himself being called and he chooses to go back out there. It doesn't seem to make sense because it's so unpleasant compared to what it could be if he just stayed in the land. Does it scare him? Does he miss home while he's out there? Well, let's see. This is in lines 39 to 47 of the text. He acknowledges that it does frighten him and he does miss home. So let's look at the lines that show us evidence of that. He says, but there isn't a man on earth so proud, so born to greatness, so bold with his youth, grown so brave and so graced by God that he feels no fear. So there's no man on earth so proud that he fears no fear as those sails unfurl, wondering what fate has willed and will do. No harps ring in his heart, no rewards, no passion for women, no worldly pleasures, nothing. Only the oceans heave, but longing wraps itself around him. So he acknowledges here, there's no man on earth who's not scared of what awaits them out in the sea, what awaits him out of the sea. And you never know what fate will do. Remember, I said that Anglo-Saxons did not really believe in free will. They believed that fate was, your life path was destined. You really couldn't change it. Okay. What does he miss when he's out at sea? Okay, let's look at lines 48 through 57 here. He says, and the monk writes, orchards blossom, the towns bloom, fields grow lovely as the world springs fresh, and all these admonish or criticize that willing mind who's leaping to journeys, always set in thoughts traveling on a quickening tide. So summer's sentinel, the cuckoo, sings in his murmuring voice, and our hearts mourn as he urges. Who could understand in ignorant ease what we others suffer as the paths of exile stretch endlessly on? So he misses the things that, are good when springtime comes and he goes out. The blossoming flowers, the blooming towns, the lovely fields, all of these things kind of speak against this weird internal calling he has to go out there because it's not pleasant when he's out there. Yet at the same time, I think we could see he feels a little torn because the adventure calls him too. All right. So lines 58 through 64. It says, even though he misses land, why can't he resist it? And this part really gets the heart of what type of exile we have here. And I'll reiterate this when I review the answers to your questions from the worksheet in week 2. This is a quote from lines 58 through 64. And yet my heart wanders away. My soul roams with the sea. The whale's home, wandering to the widest corners of the world, returning ravenous with desire. Flying solitary, screaming, exciting me to the open ocean, breaking oaths on the curve of a wave. His heart and soul calls him out there, even though he can't really explain it. There's some kind of sense of adventure that, again, can't really be rationally understood when you think of how tough it can be when he's out there. All right, there is a shift, though, in the poem, and this shift can be largely attributed to the fact that this is where the monks recording down these Anglo-Saxon stories told by word of mouth, or songs told by word of mouth, really start focusing on some more Christian elements and shift the focus of the seafarer to, let's say, more Christian ideals. Okay, so I asked the question, what is he saying about life in general, wealth, and earthly gain in like the big picture of life? So let's read this passage from lines 64 through 80. It says, thus the joys of God are fervent with life, where life itself fades quickly into the earth. The wealth of the world neither reaches to heaven nor remains. No man has ever faced the dawn certain which of fate's 3 threats would fall. Some weird typos here. Illness or age or an enemy's sword, snatching the life from his soul. The praise the living pour on the dead flowers from reputation, plant an earthly life of profit reaped even from hatred and rancor, of bravery flung in the devil's face. face, and death can only bring you earthly praise and a song to celebrate a place with the angels, life eternally blessed in the hosts of heaven. So he talks about wealth and earthly gain here as something that fades, though. The wealth of the world neither reaches to heaven, nor does it really remain much on earth. Man never knows which of fate's three threats are going to get him. Is it going to be illness? Is it going to be age? Is it going to be an enemy's sword? The praise that we get on this earth flowers from reputation. And so he's kind of reflecting now on life, as challenging as this seafaring life is, and the adventure he feels, and the struggles of being apart and exiled by choice, in this case. You see this larger reflection on the big picture of life, thinking, life in general doesn't really have much that lasts in the big picture. And this is really something that the Christian monks are adding to this narrative. Does any of this matter? Let's look at these lines. The days are gone when the kingdoms of earth flourished in glory. Now there are no rulers, no emperors, no givers of gold as once there were. When wonderful things were worked among them and they lived in lordly magnificence, those powers have vanished. Those pleasures are dead. The weakest survives and the world continues, kept spinning by toil. All glory is tarnished. The world's honor ages and shrinks, bent like the men who mold it. Their faces blanch as time advances. Their beards wither and they mourn the memory of friends, the sons of princes sown in the dust. That means buried. The soul stripped of its flesh knows nothing of sweetness or sour, feels no pain, bends neither its hand nor its brain. A brother opens his palms and pours down gold on his kinsman's grave, strewing his coffin with treasures intended for heaven. But nothing gold shakes the wrath of God, for a soul overflowing with sin and nothing hidden on the earth rises to heaven. Here you see like the elements of elegy, okay, where we're mourning the time of maybe the glory days that the seafarer was aware of. That he says, the glory days are gone. There's no more rulers. There's no more emperors, no more givers of gold. There's a kenning for your kings. All right. Those powers have vanished. He's lamenting the fact that he says like the weakest now survived. Those that grow old, their beards wither, they are just mourning the death of their friends. And he talks about kind of a practice of the Anglo-Saxons that really doesn't have much meaning. And I think this is the monks putting this in. He says, a brother opens his palms and pours down gold on his kinsman's grave, strewing his coffin with treasures intended for heaven. But nothing golden shakes the wrath of God for a soul overflowing with sin. So you see, none of that gold that you're pouring down on like the burial of a family member matters. And they did bury their, especially their prominent, like their kings and stuff, they buried their great warriors with lots of gold and treasure. But, the voice coming through now, which I think is the influence of the Christian monk, is indicating none of that gold matters. All right, and here's an excerpt from the final stanza. This is the monks like kind of preaching a sermon here. Because our thoughts return to where our home is, consider the ways of coming there, then strive for sure permission for us to rise to that eternal joy. All right, our real home is somewhere eternal. That life born in the love of God and the hope of heaven, praise the holy grace of him who honored us, eternal, unchanging creator birth. Amen. So, I think the consolation at the end of the seafarer's tale is given as the fact that, as rough as life on this earth can be and living in exile or separate from community, even though in this case it seems to be by choice, our thoughts should really focus on where our eternal home is, and that is supposed to be in heaven with God. Okay, examples of exile by choice. One could argue that the military chooses to serve in a way that ultimately ends up being exiled from their families and stuff by choice. The Deadliest Catch, I gave that example earlier. They've opted for a profession that takes them away, and just like the seafarer in this poem, the adventure of it, they feel called to it. They can't, that duty, they just feel like a connection to it, but it's really rough when they're doing it. I gave the example of astronauts. This film Gravity with Sandra Bullock and George Clooney kind of attest to that as well. The questions that you were given from your independent reading in week 2 are listed here, and I just want to kind of go through them real quick. And hopefully you found success with numbers 4 and 5, the example of alliteration and an example of a kenning. I made reference to 1 or 2 of those a moment ago. I just want to quickly go through them, and then we'll move on. All right, what type of exile is present? We definitely see exile by choice here. No one is forcing the seafarer to choose this lifestyle. He seems to be choosing it of his own free will, even though it is troubling and hard for him at times. The adventure and the calling he feels in his soul, he can't hush. And again, if you want to go back to maybe some more modern day examples of that. Okay. What causes the exile? He chooses it. He does not need to, no one forces him or into this lifestyle. It is by choice. Therefore, what causes it is just his own feeling of desire to be out there. He feels like a calling. So it's a little bit repetitive from question one. All right, what is the speaker, I should say, what is the speaker mourning the loss of in this poem? Gone are the glory days when there were givers of gold and kings and the kingdoms flourished. He laments, if we go back a couple slides, right here where he talks about things that were much better, and now it talks about everything is just, the weakest are surviving, the world is spinning by toil. Yeah, he misses the days when the kingdoms of earth flourished in glory, and he says now there's no rulers or emperors or givers of gold as there once were. Find an example of alliteration. I can't help but go back for a minute because there was a great example here. All right, and there's an example of a kenning too. So this part here is a great example of alliteration. When we were talking about this slide, it says, "And my heart wanders away, my soul roams with the sea, the whale's home." So that's a kenning for the sea. The whale's home, wandering to the widest corners of the world. See that repetitive W sound? That's alliteration. Returning ravenous with desire. Again, more alliteration. Flying solitary, screaming. More alliteration. Exciting me to the open ocean, breaking all oaths on the curve of a wave. So that passage there is chock full of alliteration. And just to touch on question 5, an example of a kenning. Okay. All right. In the Anglo-Saxon, number 6 asked this. In the Anglo-Saxon world, communities came and went quickly or came then changed and members quickly, changed members and leaders quickly. The losers of the battle were kicked off the land. In line 80, the speaker begins to talk about the present state of the world. What does he think of it, and how do these thoughts contribute to making this an elegiac poem? He's not real happy with the current situation. This is, again, referring to the fact that the days of glory and when kingdoms flourished are gone, okay? And it makes it sad because he's mourning the loss of something. He's mourning the loss of some days gone by. All right, number 7, considering this, how does the seafarer find comfort in this belief given his current circumstances in earthly exile, and speculate about the lesson, what lesson is being taught? So he finds comfort in the fact that his eternal home in heaven is still secure, and that this exile on earth is just temporary and doesn't matter anyway. So the lesson is, I guess, focus on the big picture of life and seeking to be a good Christian so that you can be in heaven with God, as opposed to the only glory you ever achieve being on earth. All right, I hope this was helpful in understanding the Seafarer. I didn't want you to do it again all independently, and I am looking forward to doing the Wanderer next. Again, the Wanderer is a little lengthy, a little easier to understand, I think, and then the Wife's Lament is pretty short. Okay, that's all for now.